Okay, so now let's have a look at how we can use the Massive Worlds Toolkit's framework to build our own open world tools. Basically, we are going to use the tools in the Massive Worlds Toolkit to create a simple asset that can generate landscape stamps, which we can save out to disk, and these can then be used by the terraforming process to apply it directly to the world. Now you'll notice that if I grab these buildings plugged into the tool, that it will update the stamp and level the terrain underneath the building so it transitions properly to the surrounding terrain. We are going to take the caches that this tool creates, we're going to load them in bulk, and then integrate them directly with the existing terraforming process as a second stage. This can then be called by the task manager to stamp the new terraforming directly into the terrain, so these buildings will always be leveled with the terrain. But alright, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is open up the Unreal project if you haven't done so yet. So go ahead and look in your folder. Now, if you've unpacked everything correctly, then you should have your Houdini scene here with the Massive Worlds folder here. And all your HDAs should be installed in the OTLs folder. Okay. Next to that, here's our Unreal project. And there's our Unreal Massive Worlds example project. So let's go ahead and boot this one up. And don't forget, of course, that you've had to install the JSON file in the My Documents folder. If you go to, in my case, Houdini 19.5, go to Packages, there's the JSON file, and in that, you should have set your project folder wherever your Massive Worlds folder is located. All right? If that's set up properly, then everything should work. Okay, so once we're in the Unreal project, let's go ahead and open up our level. You should get the Massive Worlds example map 1.1. And let's let that load up for a second. I'll just pause the video while it's doing its thing. Alright, so we're all loaded up. So if we zoom out quickly here, you'll see that currently I have my entire map loaded at this point. And that's because I've loaded all the world partition regions here. Now, if you have a weaker PC, you don't have to load the rest of the map. You'll probably only have the center part of the map here loaded, which is where our towns are located, so that should be fine. If you want to load the map, of course, you can load the left regions if you have a weaker PC. So only this map, which is the smaller map. Or if you are fine and you have enough memory, go ahead and load everything. I'll leave that up to you. Now, let's get started. So over here, this is the village where we just started out. This village here is constructed out of a couple of individual meshes, simple meshes that we can grab from our folder down here. If we go to the content, Megascans, buildings folder, you'll find a couple of assets here with their collisions, so just drag these into the map as you want. But in this case, I've already prepared a village, so we're just going to be working with that for this assignment. Next to that, there are some roads here as well, which have been drawn using blueprint splines. And then over here, we have the extract blueprint splines tool. Now, this node functions as both an extractor for blueprint splines, but it can also be used as a viewer for the actual road network, because it doesn't just include the blueprint splines, it also includes the road network that was created using the road editor tool, right? So these roads here are very rough. They are drawn using a pathfinder or potentially using a spline, which you can draw with Houdini, like a NURB spline. But these don't make a proper road. What we do then is process them into more refined roads, so these, which have better curvature, deal with intersections better, switchback turns, such as up here. All of this gets processed in the background using the PDG, and it results in this road network. But we can add to that using blueprint splines. So if I go ahead and grab a blueprint spline over here, which I've nicely organized here in this layout, I could move this road. So I'm going to drag this over, And this will boot up this extraction tool. So we're going to give that a second. And let's also move this point. Once the tool's been booted up, it's a lot faster. There we go. So this is a ground spline because it's been told to be a ground spline, meaning that it will terraform the ground to its level. So if we were to, say, move this house over here to the left, then that means that the house and its terraforming should also be moved, and it's more adjacent to this new path here. So we're basically moving the path and the house. Oops, let's undo that. There we go. So what we're going to be building here is a tool that's going to look at both these roads and the houses, and it's going to create a stamp out of it, right? Now, in order for the toolkit to actually see the changes that we've made to these blueprint splines, we have to extract them first. So I'm going to click on the extraction tool first here, and I'm going to go down to save blueprint splines to disk. And it's going to save it to the Massive Worlds Toolkit variable cache, meaning it's going to save it to this folder here. Now we're currently working on landscape 2, so I'm going to go to the second landscapes project folder. And then in here we will find the path blueprint splines file right there. Now if I go and save that, then now it will have extracted out the new updated blueprint splines. You can see here my timestamp has been changed, which matches the current timestamp here in the corner, so we know this has been updated. So that's the first step. We basically made a small modification to our roads here. Next, let's have a look at the extraction tool that's already in the scene. I've disabled it by default, but if we move up to the top of this node here, then I can enable it. I'm going to re-enable the tool, and it's going to process the current road network, which we just extracted out to our cache, and it's going to grab these houses. Now, I have noticed that there's a little bug in this version of the Houdini engine. I'm not sure why, but if you don't see the mesh update, just save your changes and it should appear. You will notice that this has not been updated. So let's go ahead and click on reload cache on this node. There we go. So what just happened is that the node itself was still grabbing an old cache. If you want to refresh the node, make sure it grabs the latest file that we just extracted out for the roads. Then you can click on reload cache over here. Likewise, if you've updated the terrain, you can click on reload tiles, or just, rebuild the entire tool and that will do the same. Regardless, the node now knows where the new path is, and also you might notice that this building here has its own stamp below it. So let's hide the terrain, and I'm going to disable on this node, on this tool, the terraforming stamp. So we're only going to see the footprints that these buildings are making. Again, I'm just going to save to make it refresh. And here we go. So this basically is the stamp, or rather the footprint of this building. And what the tool is going to do is it's going to compare the footprint of each building to each other and to the nearby roads. It's going to do the same thing for the roads as well, and it's going to create a fall-off value for each of these objects and then combine it together into a final stamp. So let's go ahead and turn this back on. Let's enable the terraforming stamp again. Bring that back. And I'm also going to bring the terrain back as well. I'm going to hide my other tools over here. And what I would like to do now is make a couple changes to this town. Nothing too much, but enough to demonstrate how the stamping process works. Because ultimately, if we ignore, say, the trees in this area. What we're basically going to do is take our buildings, take our roads, and we're going to make a modification that changes the shape of our terrain, right? So for example, let's grab this house here. I just added this house in. Let's make a copy. Drop that over here. Let's also maybe grab a couple of other small houses over here and drag those back here. Nothing too major. And let's go ahead and add one more road in from there over here or something. Maybe we want to lower that just a little. Okay, so for the roads, I'm going to grab a new blueprint spline. So let's repeat what we did before. I could go ahead and actually copy an existing blueprint spline, or we can go to the Massive Worlds folder, find the road blueprint splines, drag one in here, and let's set this one to a trail, which is a smaller road. It's basically a footpath. It's one of the presets that you can find in the road data table, defined over here. And this one is only, let's say, 2 meters wide and has a limited fall off by default. Okay, so we're going to place this one around here where the road editor path is, the processed road that's in the cache. And I'm just going to quickly draw out a short path. Now, what this is going to do, ultimately, is it's going to create a stamp that sits on top of, and is not directly part of, the regular road terraforming. And I'll talk about it in a second. But basically, what we're going to do is we're first going to run the terraformer, which terraforms in all of our roads, and then we're going to superimpose upon that these stamps. So what we do need to do here is make sure that our stamp actually includes these roads. We could also build this in natively, meaning that let's say these stamps are computed during the same terraforming process as our roads. However, doing so does make the terraforming process a bit heavier, and that costs more memory. So to make it more memory efficient, we're actually going to do this in 2 stages. Think of it like stages of a rocket, right? We drop one stage, that loosens the memory, and then the next stage takes over. But that does mean that we're effectively creating a 2-step process. Now, I do need to add this road to my road network. I do want to make this tool here see that. And this tool, this stamping tool, does not have an input for road splines. So this does need to be added to the blueprint spline cache so that the tool here will see it. So let's do that. Let's click on the blueprint spline paths asset here. Let's go to its input. And depending if you're using Houdini 20 or not, this will look slightly different. That's not a major issue. Just basically start your selection. Make sure you don't deselect the existing splines. And then we can add our road over here. Just control click that. And then click use current selection. If you do that, this node will update and we should have our road added over here. Alright, now we're going to again save this out. So we're going to save that to disk. And next, let's go to our stamp tool. And I'm going to say reload cache. That's going to see the updated spline. Right, and we might have to actually save the asset because for some reason my visual doesn't always update, which is particularly annoying. I've only really noticed this on this tool, not on any other tools, and I'm not really sure what I'm doing different here. But regardless, you can see here that the road is part of the output. Let me just move these houses a little bit so they sit roughly around this path. And you will notice that the actual terraforming should be matching our blueprint spline. If I were to select our blueprint spline and I ignore the terrain, it should be at the same height, right? That's of course our intention. Blueprint splines will terraform the terrain to their exact height, at least in their default configuration. That's their entire point. Now, before we continue, I still need to go ahead and add these buildings to the tool as well, because these new buildings that we just created are not yet seen by the tool. As you can see, we don't have a proper yellow outline for them. So without that, they won't actually be stamped into the terrain. So let's go ahead over here, go to Object Input, go to Start Selection, and we're going to also add these buildings. So with that, if we let it update, there we go, this should apply our terraforming, right? And then I'm going to go down to my save function here. I'm going to say save stamp to disk. Now if I click that, then now in my cache it's going to have added this new data. So let's go over here, go to mesh stamps, and you'll notice that now we have, well, a new stamp. Now why is that? And that is because I've actually added my stamp right on the border between two tiles. And I suspect that the center of this stamp has moved slightly. So as a result, we now have actually output a stamp for this particular town. But because the pivot of the center of the stamp has moved a bit, we now have another stamp. One we don't really need, right? We don't want two stamps occupying the same space. If we were to load both of these, they'd probably be overlapping each other. In fact, we can test that theory. Let's go over here. I'm just going to open this up quickly. Let's grab both of these. And I'm going to grab you. And we're going to grab the one we just created. Notice how they're both occupying the same space. So because they have different IDs, this is going to cause a problem. So what we want to do here is actually clean out our folder a little bit and remove our old stamp. This method that we're employing here does write files to disk, and unless you make some kind of asset that allows you to see these files and say analyze which one's where in the scene, which one has the same name, you might have to do some manual cleaning in this folder. So in our case, we're going to delete tree 4. We're going to keep tree 5 in this case. Let's get rid of you. So that will at least make sure that we don't have two overlapping stamps, because what our system is going to do is it's going to take our landscape and it's going to stamp in these stamps one after the other on top of each other. So they're basically going to override each other. And, well, one of them is going to be visible, and that's probably going to be in alphabetical order. So just in case, we're going to clean it out. Make sure we only have this stamp here and the stamp that sits here in this part where this church is on the hill. In fact, if we were to recompute this and enable its stamp, you'll see what I mean. I'm just going to save that. There we go. So here you can see we have two stamps which are occupying the same tile. And that's basically what I mean. It's going to write a cache for both of these. Now the reason they can coexist is because they have been assigned a different stamp ID. If this guy had stamp ID 1 and I were to save this right now, I'd be overwriting the file that this tool has written out. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. It is somewhat intelligent that if you put a tool in, say, a different tile, it's going to make sure that it's writing it to a different name. So these two won't, interfere with one another. But we do need to make sure that if they exist in the same tile, you're aware of which stamps are in that area, and you don't overwrite the wrong stamp. Anyway, let's go ahead and take this and run the terraformer next. So before we dive into the node network, let's actually see how this works in Unreal. what we're going to do is we're going to find the task manager. And I've created a custom task manager for this workshop. If we click that one, and let's go ahead and rebuild it, so it should be updated. And then let's scroll down, and let's locate the road terraforming tab over here. Now in this case, we have changed the town in landscape 2, this landscape here near the beach. So I'm only going to recompute the terraforming for landscape 2. We're going to leave landscape 1 alone. This will be a bit faster. And I'm also going to include my mesh stamps stage. So both of these need to be active. Next, down here, for your case, you need to go ahead and make sure all of these assets are set up. They should already be set up in the example file. But the most important part here is that you have these guys set to black box, because your assets will be black box HDAs. Then click on Reassemble File Paths. And what that will do is it will make sure that these file paths here are set up for the PDG to use. Because for some reason the PDG doesn't like to use the variables like this. It won't set it properly. So I've set up a little system here that will basically make sure that the right file is picked over here in our OTLs folder for the PDG to use to render in the background. These are our HDAs, right? Then down here, we want to say which layers we actually want to render. In this case, I would like to render all of these, including the edit layers, visibility, etc. I would like to regenerate the darken layer as well. If you want to save some memory, you can turn this off. This does take a bit of memory. And then next to that, we want to render out our composite layers as well. And then, depending on how many cores your PC has and how much memory you have to spare, you can actually make the PDG render a bit faster if down here you increase your total amount of threads that Houdini can use. So in my case, I'm going to set this to, let's say, 12 threads. I'm going to increase my batch size to 80. And we're going to make sure that it's cooking out of process, which basically means that it's going to spin up some background sessions of Houdini, some interfaceless sessions that are going to compute each one a batch of our tiles, right? Because ultimately what we're basically going to do here is recompute the tiles for our landscape so we can stamp this town into the terrain. All right, with this in place, we can scroll up. You can close all these if you want to. We are going to go up to the top here, make sure that terraforming is selected. And I'm just in case going to specify that I want to have the compute terraforming output over here. I don't need this. And then let's say dirty all, and then cook output. Okay, now this is going to take a moment. It shouldn't be too long, but the first thing it's going to do is it's going to compute in the background. If we go over to our processes here, under Unreal, you'll see that it's running a hyphon session. And in that hyphon session, it's currently computing out one of the stages of our terraforming pipeline. Now, while this is cooking, let's go over to the Houdini scene for a second and have a look at what it's actually doing. So over here, we have the presets and PDG tab in our example file. Let's go over to our task manager for the workshop and let's jump inside. So in here we have all our different PDG tasks that we can run from the task manager. And the one that we want to look at here is compute terraforming. So let's go in there. And this is basically the terraforming network that it's currently running. Now, if we look down the network, what we've basically done is we've bypassed landscape 1 that's currently not being computed. Instead, we're currently computing landscape 2. Now, what's first going to do is run our terraforming node, our terraforming process. I highlighted that earlier in the presentation, which is located over here. It's going to run this terraforming network, where it's going to load in the terrain, whatever the latest landscape was that we extracted using the extraction tool. It's going to terraform in the roads. It's going to terraform in the tunnels and the bridge heads. It's going to apply some materials. It's going to set the visibility state for the tunnels as well. And over here, it's recomputing the darken layer, which adds a bit of extra darkness to the terrain, adds a bit more detail. Then it's going to bring it all back together again, and it's going to output it. Now there's two forms of output on this node. One outputs the landscape for further editing. The other one outputs the tiles for final rendering. Now normally the PNet nodes are able to render out tiles by themselves using their own internal PDG setup. But in this case, we're basically externalizing that by running this node here in the PDG. So I basically split out the render component and I'm running that after everything is done. Let's move up. Then this next node over here is the mesh stamp node. We'll be looking at that as well in a moment. But that node will then run afterwards. So what it's going to do is it's first going to compute out our terrain with our roads. And then it's going to take those mesh stamps and it's going to apply those to the terrain as well. It's going to collect all the tiles together that it's going to output. And then down here we have the batch tile exporter, which is going to run over all those tiles and it's going to output them to our tile folder, which is incidentally what it's doing right here. So all these tasks that you're seeing spinning up, that's basically all our tiles that it's computing in the background. If we have a quick look at our tiles folder, you'll probably find that it's currently updating our tiles. So we go to landscape 2. We go to, say, the darken layer. Okay. And if we look at our timestamps, let's bring up the last date modified. Over here you can see that based on my timestamp and my current time, these files are currently being updated. So if we were to find our town, for example, see if we can find that one. We look for our dirt roads, because the road we just added, these roads here, these are by default dirt roads. So if we look over into this file and we locate our new town, it should be over here. Now it's right on the border of this tile, but you can see that this new side road here is actually added to it. It's a bit hard to see. Okay, so it's done. Now what it's done additionally is it's also calculated out some overlap tiles. That's a separate function altogether, but that basically allows these landscapes to seamlessly transition with one another. Anyway, our tiles have now been output. It's done. So let's go ahead and stamp this into the terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this tool. You can also incidentally just press G. That will hide everything as well. And what I want to do is go to the landscape editor, go to landscape 2. We are going to modify the procedural layer first, which contains the height modifications for all of our procedural changes. Go to import. We're going to select height map. And then let's go ahead and select our tiles. Now to do that, we need to navigate to our Massive Worlds main folder here. Go to the tile folder under landscape 2 in this case. We then want to find our procedural layer and then we just select one of these tiles. Click open, click yes, and now it should give us a stamp that aligns to this landscape. If we click import next, we should see our terraforming here change. Let's just zoom out a bit so we can see this clearly. As you can see, we've now stamped in our buildings as well as our road over here. And if we press the G key, we can toggle between our preview mesh and the actual terrain, and these should be quite accurate, right? Because we've basically stamped in the shape of this into the landscape, and only where it fades out towards the actual real landscape is where this is going to take over again. This also works with our roads. So if we go over here, you'll notice how the transition between the original road, which is outside of our stamp, and the actual village stamp are pretty much seamless, because the village stamp uses the same roads as the regular road terraforming, but here inside the stamp this is taken over. Now, one of the reasons that you might want to use this approach is because this stamp will not change. As long as the stamp is inside the cache folder here, it's locked down. And unless you're going to move the roads around, this is not going to change. So whatever, say, landmark or point of interest you're creating using this node, it's not going to change on you. But it is procedural. We can go ahead and modify it and then re-output it again, and that will give us a new piece of terraforming. Now, at the moment we've only applied our height stamp, so let's also add in our materials as well. I'm going to hide this one again. Let's press G. And let's go back to the landscape editor. And let's import our material layers. Now, something to note is that you want to make sure that you have a height map selected, but you don't want to have it written out, because we are going to apply these layers to the base layer. The reason for that is because I don't currently support adding materials into multiple edit layers. You should always put your materials in one edit layer only. Houdini 20 can technically extract out the material layers for each and every one of these edit layers, but this ends up being multiplicative, and as a result, the more material layers you have, combined with the more edit layers you have, it makes the extraction process for the landscape way heavier. So assuming you have the latest version of the Houdini engine, this is no longer the case, but in Houdini 20 it had the nasty tendency to want to extract out way too many of these material edit layers. And luckily that's been disabled, but I also don't support it in the toolset. So what you want to do is go to the base layer and then make sure the height map file is specified but not enabled, because we don't want to inadvertently also override our base layer's height, right? We want to leave that alone. If you've done this correctly, then now it will give you an import resolution which matches the resolution of the tiles in this folder. And then we are going to override two layers here. We're going to specify the procedural dirt road layer. So let's find that in here. Let's say procedural dirt road. And also for underneath the buildings, I am going to override the dirt layer. Now the dirt layer is a weighted material, unlike the procedural dirt road, which means that it's weighted to several other layers in here as well. And in order to make that work properly, we might also have to import, say, our auto forest layer as well. So let's grab this dirt. Doesn't matter which tile in the folder you grab, it should just work. And then over here we're going to override our auto forest layer as well. This should help balance out if there are any stamps in the wrong location. If we go ahead and do that, and then make sure we're on base layer, click import. And now we will have stamped in our roads, and also we'll have stamped in our dirt underneath our houses, right? Okay, so that's basically how you go about changing the terrain with this tool. Alright, so let's go ahead and bring back our trees. To do that, let's press G, bring back all of our tools, and let's press Ctrl H to unhide our trees as well. And next, you might have a case where some of your trees are overlapping the new sections of your town, or potentially because you've modified the height of the surrounding terrain, some of the trees may now be inside the terrain or floating. So we'll want to make sure we update our loader as well. To do that, what we want to do is reactivate the loader for the vegetation that sits inside of that area. At the moment, I've set up a bunch of spawners here for the vegetation. If I hide this, you'll see that all the trees go ahead and disappear. The way how this works is that these spawners can create a cache file on the hard drive that contains the trees for our particular landscape. So in this case, I have one cache file for all the default propsing in this landscape here. So if we look for that, it's this file right there. It's located in the cache folder for landscape 2 in the props subfolder, and then basically that's the file that contains all the tree positions that have been computed out based on the landscape as it is at this point. Now, these caches do contain trees that also overlap things like roads or our village, for example. So the way how this works is that the loader actually does a couple of things. If we set this tool here to loading mode instead of spawning mode, we can load a cache on disk, specify which landscape belongs to, then down here specify which cache file we want to load, and then down here we can say how we want to load it. Now I've set this particular system to load it by tile ID. So at the moment it's loading it based on a starting position in the corner of the tile and then up to a certain amount of tiles out. So it's basically saying here from coordinate position x2, y4, load 2 tiles in x and y. Okay. Then next, the loader will snap the trees to the current height of the terrain that it sees in the, let's see here, composite post-procedural layer in the master folder. So at the moment, the tool is basically being instructed to load these files. Composite post-procedural. These are the composite height files of the terrain that have been output by the terraforming process we ran just now. Now, as a result, all these trees should now be able to see the new height of the terrain. That is a combination of all the edit layers, because that's what the post-procedural layer contains. It's basically up to the micro layer in our landscape editor, right? And then we want to actually go ahead and exclude out some of these trees. Now to do that, normally I'd first rebuild the tool. But if you do that, Houdini will have to purge the previous result first. And that's going to take a second. Now, depending on if the tool's already been booted up, that is going to lock up Unreal for a moment. That's because it has to basically get rid of all the old references to the vegetation that it previously spawned. And the more it spawned, and the more variations of that vegetation it spawned, the longer that will take. But once it's done that, and the tool is activated and booted up properly, it will be a lot faster. So I'm just going to wait a second for it to finish reinstantiating. Okay, so it looks like it just finished. Let's give it a second to get back to us. Sometimes you just have to wiggle the screen a little bit, and there we go. So now the tool basically has been booted up and it's ready to go. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we move this red curve over here. Over here you'll see I have this red outline. If we find one of its anchor points, we can select it. And this is currently the exclusion curve for our village. Now the way how this works is that this particular tool here has been provided with a couple of exclusion splines. For example, this curve here, if we look up, is basically a Massive Worlds selection spline blueprint that's been provided to the tool. And if we move this guy, so if I make this guy go inside the village, it will force the tool to update and spawn our trees back in, right? Now the roads will automatically call out the trees based on the radius of the trees. But our village doesn't do that. Now, these roads inside the village might, but the buildings won't. So we have to actually go ahead and draw a spline around it. So let's go ahead and let's draw a new one. Let me just quickly add a new curve somewhere around this village to demonstrate how this works. Now if we want to add another spline, let's say we find an area out here that we can remove some trees in. Like let's say over here. We're going to add a selection blueprint here. And what this will do, if we have G enabled, it will give us a selection tool. We can say what type of selection curve we want. In this case, the spawner responds to inclusion and exclusion splines. So I'm going to set it to exclusion mode. And then we can go ahead and draw a circle in this area. And then all we have to do is provide this to our spawner. So I'm going to go over to the spawner. Let's go to the setup tab. And in here, let's add this to our selection. We do that. Give it a second to compute that. It will remove all the vegetation that this spawner was creating in this area. So this allows you to create a place in the world where all vegetation of any kind is removed by this particular loader. Now, if you only want to remove certain types of assets, you can also do that. You can go to the spline here, go to the custom string, which is a variable that's being fed to Houdini. And then let's go ahead and feed it, let's say, remove only all large objects. Now, updating this won't immediately tell the tool that it needs to be recomputed. So either we move the spline about, or we tell the tool to reload, or potentially to just reload its inputs. Let's just move the spline a little. As a result now, once it updates, it's still going to spawn some of our trees, but it's going to remove the biggest trees, right? Alternatively, we can just say we want to remove all trees, or trees and all large objects, or all the stones, or all the bushes. Whatever you basically want to clear out, you can do that using this basic tag system. I'm not going to go too deep into this, because that's a whole other lecture. And I'll actually be covering this in some future tutorial videos. But for now, let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Because with this, we should now have our village cleared of trees, and we can go ahead and test play this. So let's go ahead and save our changes. And let's put our character in there, and let's have a quick walk around. Okay, so here we are. So now, as you can see, we have our terrain in place. Most of the buildings should be properly sitting on top of the terrain. They should not be floating. Terraforming stamp basically uses the lowest polygon of the mesh to determine how high the building is. So it's not super intelligent. You can probably make this more accurate in some cases, depending on what type of buildings you're feeding it. You could base it on the grid height of the building instead of the lowest polygon. But regardless, it works quite well. As you can see, we've created nice little plateaus around our buildings. And one of the things you might notice is that if we go to, say, a very steep area between some of our structures, is that we have a smooth transition between the buildings where they don't overlap each other. So here we have a nice little cliff, and then nice flat transition to this building. The terraforming between the buildings does not overlap. And I'll explain in a bit how this works. Basically uses the weighted fall off and some of the nodes in the toolkit to handle this process.